The historian Thucydides opens his account of the Peloponnesian War with a sentence that has puzzled scholars for 500 years. He begins writing while the war is still happening, because he already knows, somehow, that this conflict will be the greatest the world has ever seen. He was right, and he was also a general on one of the losing sides. What Thucydides understood, living through it, is something that historians keep rediscovering. The Peloponnesian War was not a war about territory. It was not primarily a war about trade or religion or any of the standard explanations ancient wars get assigned. It was a war about fear. Specifically, about what happens when one civilization becomes so successful that the civilization next to it can no longer tolerate its existence. Athens in the mid-5th century BCE was something genuinely new in the world. It had invented democracy. It had bankrolled the Parthenon. It had produced Sophocles, Socrates, and Phidias simultaneously. It commanded the most powerful navy in the Mediterranean and was collecting tribute from over 150 city-states across the Aegean. And Sparta, the warrior state that had held the balance of power in Greece for a century, looked at all of this and understood with cold clarity that either Athens would eventually dominate the entire Greek world, or it had to be stopped. The war that followed lasted 27 years. It killed a significant fraction of the Greek-speaking world. It ended Athenian imperial power permanently. And when it was over, neither side had won anything that lasted longer than a generation. This is the whole story, from the first tremors of conflict to the silence of egospotamy. Subscribe, hit the bell, drop a like before we go. This one goes all the way. Before the war begins, you need to understand the trap both cities walked into, and how neither of them saw it closing around them until it was too late. The Persian Wars ended in 479 BCE with the Greeks having performed the military miracle of the ancient world. A collection of fractious city-states had repelled the largest empire on earth not once, but twice. The victory at Salamis in 480 and Plataea in 479 should have been followed by a long era of Greek cooperation and collective security. Instead, it was followed by something far more dangerous, the emergence of Athens as a superpower. Athens had provided the navy at Salamis. Athens had built the long walls connecting the city to its harbor at Piraeus, making it effectively impregnable to land assault. And Athens had reorganized the defensive alliance formed against Persia, the Delian League, into something that looked increasingly like an Athenian empire. Member states contributed ships or silver. Athens collected the silver, kept it on the Acropolis, and spent it on its own infrastructure. The Parthenon itself was built with Delian League tribute that was supposed to fund collective Greek defense. Sparta seems to have been particularly alarmed at the growing power of Athens, able to build an ever bigger fleet thanks to tributes from its allies and dependents. Sparta was also suspicious of the Athenians' project to rebuild their long wall fortifications, which protected their harbor of Piraeus. In addition, Sparta was concerned that inaction would push the other major Greek power, Corinth, to side with Athens. The First Peloponnesian War, a series of conflicts running roughly from 460 to 446 BCE, was the warning shot that both sides somehow failed to heed. It ended with the 30 Years' Peace, signed in 446 BCE, which attempted to freeze the existing balance of power. Athens kept its maritime empire, Sparta kept its dominance of the Peloponnese, and neither side would interfere in the other's sphere. The treaty lasted 15 years. What broke it was a dispute that neither Athens nor Sparta initially sought. Corinth, Sparta's most important ally, picked a fight with Corcyra over an Adriatic colony, and Corcyra, a significant naval power, applied to Athens for an alliance. Athens accepted. Corinth went to Sparta furious, and Sparta found itself in the position Thucydides described with surgical precision. The growth of Athenian power, and the fear this inspired in Sparta, made war inevitable. When the war formally began in 431 BCE, Athens had the better plan. This is the part that most popular accounts get wrong. Pericles wasn't simply being passive or overly cautious. He had constructed a strategy of elegant precision that, if executed faithfully, should have ground Sparta into exhausted submission within a decade. The strategy rested on a fundamental asymmetry. Sparta led an army into Attica and began devastating the region around Athens. Pericles declined to engage the superior allied forces and instead urged the Athenians to keep to their city and make full use of their naval superiority by harassing their enemies' coasts and shipping. The logic was unimpeachable. Sparta had the best land army in Greece. Athens had the best navy. Sparta could burn crops in Attica every summer, but Athens could import everything it needed by sea through the port of Piraeus. The long walls made the city essentially an island. Meanwhile, Athenian naval raids would slowly bleed Sparta's allies economically, erode their will to fight, and force a peace on Athenian terms. Then the plague arrived. Athens was hit by a devastating plague arriving from Egypt via Persia in 430 BCE, and Sparta even postponed her annual invasion to avoid it. The crowding caused by Pericles' strategy, the entire population of Attica sheltering inside the long walls, created exactly the conditions the plague needed. Within a few months, Pericles fell victim to the terrible plague that raged through the crowded city, killing a large part of its army as well as many civilians. Thucydides survived an attack of the plague and left a vivid account of its impact on Athenian morale. The numbers are staggering. Modern epidemiologists, analyzing Thucydides' clinical description and confirmed by skeletal evidence from a mass grave discovered in Athens in 1994, estimate the plague killed between a quarter and a third of the Athenian population in 3 devastating years. In the same year, Pericles was ousted, and Athens sued for peace, only to be rejected by Sparta. The rejection was Sparta's great strategic error. They had Athens weakened, leaderless, and demoralized. They refused peace and gave Athens time to recover, regroup, and find new leaders. The war's first phase ground on for another decade, producing the precarious Peace of Nicias in 421 BCE, a fragile truce built on mutual exhaustion and unmet obligations that would hold for exactly 6 years before Athens committed the worst strategic decision in the history of Greek warfare. Pericles' strategy should have worked. If the plague had never arrived, historians believe Athens might have won the war by 420 BCE. Drop a comment. Do you think the plague changed the entire course of Western history? Yes or no? I want to read your answers before we go into the disaster that finished Athens. The Peace of Nicias was signed in 421 BCE, with both sides exhausted and neither satisfied. Sparta had never taken a significant Athenian city. Athens had never broken Spartan military dominance. The peace was supposed to last 50 years. It produced 6 years of armed mistrust before Athens made a decision that a brilliant young general named Alcibiades convinced the assembly was an opportunity, and that history would record as one of the greatest acts of collective folly ever committed by a democratic government. The Sicilian expedition was an Athenian military expedition to Sicily, which took place from 415 to 413 BC during the Peloponnesian War. The expedition ended in a devastating defeat for Athenian forces, severely affecting Athens. It was hampered from the outset by uncertainty in its purpose and command structure. Political maneuvering in Athens swelled a lightweight force of 20 ships into a massive armada. And the expedition's primary proponent, Alcibiades, was recalled from command to stand trial before the fleet even reached Sicily. Alcibiades' argument to the Athenian assembly was seductive precisely because it contained a kernel of strategic truth surrounded by catastrophic overconfidence. Syracuse was supplying grain to Sparta. Taking Syracuse would cut that supply and give Athens control of Sicily's enormous resources. From Sicily, Carthage. From Carthage, dominance of the entire Western Mediterranean. It was not lunacy. It was hubris. The Greek concept of overreach so extreme, it invites divine punishment. The night before the fleet was to sail, someone destroyed many of the Hermae, stone markers representing Hermes, placed around the city for good luck. This was taken very seriously as an omen for the expedition, as well as evidence of a revolutionary conspiracy to overthrow the government. Considerable suspicion fell on Alcibiades. The fleet proceeded to Catania, where an Athenian ship arrived to inform Alcibiades that he was under arrest for supposedly profaning the Eleusinian mysteries. Alcibiades agreed to return in his ship, but when they stopped in southern Italy, he escaped and sailed to the Peloponnese, where he sought refuge in Sparta. Athens passed a death sentence in absentia. In Sparta, Alcibiades gave the Peloponnesian League critical intelligence on every weakness in the Athenian Empire. He advised them to send a general to Syracuse. They sent Gylippus, and Gylippus transformed a Syracusan defense that was on the verge of collapse into one that destroyed the entire Athenian armada. 10,000 hoplites, around 2,000 skirmishers and light infantry, 1,000 cavalry, and over 200 triremes were completely annihilated in under 2 years. The Syracusans executed both Nicias and Demosthenes and imprisoned their men in stone quarries for months. Those who did not die under these conditions were sold into slavery. Athens had sent its finest army and its largest fleet to Sicily. Neither came back. After Sicily, Athens should have been finished. That it survived another 9 years. That it built new fleets, fought new battles, and came astonishingly close to turning the war around, is one of the most remarkable stories of institutional resilience in ancient history. But resilience, in the end, was not enough against the combination that Sparta eventually assembled: Lysander's strategic genius, Persian money, and the systematic destruction of every advantage Athens had managed to maintain. The key change after 413 BCE was Persian involvement. Sparta, with financial help from Persia, finally won the conflict by destroying the Athenian fleet at Aegospotami in 405 BCE. The Persian calculation was straightforward. Athens's empire threatened Persian interests in Ionia. A Spartan victory, funded by Persian silver, would remove Athens as a power and restore Persia's ability to control the Aegean coastline. The Spartans also chose a new commander, Lysander, an incorruptible politician who had distinguished himself both as a diplomat and as an admiral. Lysander understood something that Spartan generals before him had missed. The war could not be won on land because Athens's lifeline was the sea. The target was not Athens's walls. It was Athens's grain supply, specifically the fleet that protected the route from the Black Sea grain-producing regions to Piraeus. Alcibiades, in one of history's strangest career arcs, had by this point defected back to Athens, having worn out his welcome in Sparta by reportedly sleeping with the Spartan king's wife, and briefly commanded the Athenian fleet with genuine effectiveness. His absence from command during one crucial engagement, when his deputy mishandled the fleet, proved fatal. The end came at Aegospotami on the Hellespont in 405 BCE. Lysander waited until most of the Athenian crews had gone ashore looking for food, then launched a full attack on the beached Athenian fleet. The war concluded with the Spartan victory at Aegospotami, leading to Athens's surrender and the decline of its empire. Of 180 Athenian triremes, Lysander captured 170. The Athenian sailors, who were taken prisoner, several thousand men, were executed on the spot. Athens had no fleet. Without a fleet, it could not import grain. With no grain, the city would starve within months. There was nothing left to negotiate except the terms of surrender. In the spring of 404 BCE, after nearly a year of blockade and starvation, Athens surrendered. The Corinthians and the Thebans, who had suffered most from Athenian imperialism over the previous 3 decades, argued for the complete destruction of the city. Sparta refused. Athens had stood against Persia at Marathon and Salamis. Its contribution to Greek civilization was too great to erase. Instead, Lysander's settlement was simultaneously vindictive and unstable. The long walls were demolished to the sound of flute music, as Spartan allies celebrated what they believed was the permanent end of Athenian power. The Athenian navy was reduced to 12 ships. The democratic constitution was suspended and replaced by the 30 tyrants. A pro-Spartan oligarchy that proceeded to execute or exile hundreds of Athenian citizens in a reign of terror that lasted only 8 months before democratic resistance overthrew it. Athens lost its empire and never regained its dominant political influence. Lysander installed an oligarchic government, but a democratic system was restored within a few years. Although Sparta won the war, its heavy-handed policies brought forth new rebellions, and Spartan power declined after the defeat at Leuctra in 371 BCE. This is the paradox that Thucydides, writing with the cold clarity of someone who had lived through the whole catastrophe, understood with painful precision. Nobody won the Peloponnesian War. Athens lost its empire and its political preeminence. Sparta inherited an empire it had no institutional capacity to manage, and discovered within 30 years that winning hegemony over Greece was far easier than keeping it. Sparta struggled to maintain control and stability across Greece. Entire regions were devastated, trade declined, and populations shrank due to war, plague, and starvation. Sparta emerged victorious but lacked the infrastructure to manage an empire. The war that Thucydides called the greatest in history left Greece systematically weakened at precisely the moment that a new power to the north, Macedonia, was beginning its rise. 42 years after Athens surrendered at Aegospotami, Philip II of Macedonia would conquer Greece almost without effort, because the city-states had spent 3 generations destroying each other. Some scholars have argued that Athenian hegemony, without defeat, might have promoted the cause of democracy and united the Greeks so that they would have later been in a stronger position to fight Alexander the Great and the Romans. Thucydides knew what he was watching. He wrote it all down with the precision of a clinician and the grief of someone who loved Athens and could not save it. The history of the Peloponnesian War remains 500 years later, the foundational text for anyone trying to understand what happens when fear drives great powers into wars neither side can afford to win. 27 years. A plague that may have killed a third of Athens' population. A naval disaster in Sicily that destroyed the finest army and fleet the city had ever assembled. A final defeat at Aegospotami that ended Athenian naval power permanently. And in the aftermath, not triumph, but exhaustion, instability, and the slow unraveling of a civilization that had, just 60 years earlier, invented democracy and built the Parthenon. The lesson Thucydides wanted us to draw is simple and uncomfortable. The most dangerous force in international relations is not ambition, not greed, not ideological rivalry. It is fear. Fear of what another power might become. Fear of losing the position you currently hold. Fear that inaction is more dangerous than war. That fear made the Peloponnesian War inevitable, according to Thucydides, and it made it catastrophic for both sides. If this video gave you something to think about that you didn't have before, drop a like, share it with someone who loves ancient history, and click the next video on screen. It was chosen specifically for people who made it to the end of this one.